Now that we have graphed some square root functions, let's graph a few more. Let's change some of the parameters that could happen. We're going to still follow the same 5 rules or steps. The first step that we're going to use is to find the domain and the range of the function. We're going to identify from that domain whether x is going to be getting bigger or smaller, whether it's going to be going off in the positive direction or the negative direction. Same with the range. Will it be going off in the positive direction or in the negative direction? And from that domain and range starting point, we get our first point. We're going to graph that starting point. And then we're going to find and plot 2 more points. From those 2 points and our original point, we will then draw our graph. Let's take a look at this function, f of x equals -2 times the square root of x plus 4 plus a 3. And we're going to start by looking for our domain. And our domain will be based on the fact that x plus 4 has to be greater than or equal to 0, which means x has to be greater than or equal to -4. If x is greater than or equal to -4, that's where x values are going to begin, back at -4, and they're going to continue to get bigger from there. Our range will be based on that 3 and the -2. So our y's are going to have to start at 3, but because the 2 is negative, they are going to get smaller from that point. Y's have to be less than or equal to -3. So let's make a little xy chart. Let's put in that particular point, -4, 3, as our starting point. Okay, -4, 3. And then let's put in some more points from there. If we put in a -3 for x, in other words, find out what f of -3 is. That's going to be -2 times the square root of -3 plus 4 plus a 3. And once again, a little bit of practice and you'll recognize that a -3 plus a 4 is a 1, and a square root of 1 is a nice simple square root to be dealing with. So -2 times a 1 is a -2 plus a 3, and that's going to give us a 1. So we have our second point, the point -3, 1. So we'll plot that point, and then we'll go look for another. Okay. The next point that I'm going to look for is x value of 0. And the reason I'm going to choose the 0 is my next perfect square after square root of 0 and the square root of 1 is the square root of 4. So we now have -2 times the square root of 0 plus 4 plus a 3, which gives us a -2 times the square root of 4 plus a 3, or a -2 times a 2, or a -4 plus a 3 becoming a -1. And now we've got our third point. Now we can go back in and graph this function. It's going to start back here. Kind of missed the point there. Let's see if we can erase that and maybe clean it up a little bit. Hang on, I'll get right back to you. Sorry about that. I drew in our graph. Once again, we're starting at the point -4, 3, and then we're continuing kind of down from that point through these other 2 points that we have found. Let's take a look at one last example here. Our last example is f of x equals the square root of 3 minus x minus 2. And we're going to start, of course, by looking for our domain. And our domain will be that 3 minus x has to be greater than or equal to 0 because we can't put a negative under our square root. -x is greater than or equal to -3, or that x would have to actually be less than or equal to +3. Keep in mind we just divided or multiplied by -1, so we have to turn around the sign. Some people would have started with the first step of adding x to both sides. You would have come up with the exact same thing for your domain. Our y values, on the other hand, or our range values, are going to be that y has to be greater than or equal to -2. There's no negative in front of the square root, which means my y values are going to get bigger, but they're going to start at a -2. So let's make a little xy chart. let's get our starting point of 3, -2 into our XY chart and onto our graph, and let's pick some more values from there. Now this one might be a little bit more tricky, a little bit different in this fact that it's harder to see sometimes what is going to give us a perfect square on the inside. So I'm going to start with an f of a 2. In other words, that 3 minus 2 is going to give us a 1. So I've got a square root of 3 minus 2 minus a 2. In other words, a square root of 1 minus a 2, or a 1 minus a 2, which becomes a -1. So we have the point 2, -1 as our next point. Let's get these labeled here. 2, -1, and we had the point 3, -2. From there we need one more point. Now this one gets to be a little bit more difficult to see, but if I want the square root to be of a 4, the next perfect square that we have to actually add a 1 to the 3, or subtract a -1. So I'm going to do an f of a -1 equals a square root of a 3 minus a -1 minus our 2. Our 3 minus our -1 is going to become a square root of 4, and our square root of 4 is going to become a 2, and then our 2 minus 2 is going to eventually become a 0. And we end up with the point, let's put it in the right place though, -1, 0. -1, 0. And now we're ready to graph our square root graph. Probably a little less straight, a little more curve to it. Once again, I'll probably try and come back to you in a second here and show you what it looks like. Sorry, I sometimes take a little bit of time to make sure I get my curve in there somewhat nicely. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be a fairly good representation of what our graph looks like. I hope that helps you understand how to go about graphing a square root function. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask, and I'd be happy to help you out.